Kate will be live. We should be live.
Thanks, Jess.
Good morning. This is Manfred.
Good morning.
Good morning, all. I have 10 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. I appreciate, as always, everybody taking time out of their busy schedules to get together and talk about these important issues. Lots of really good information and thoughts to talk about for today. So let's start, Kate, with a roll call, if we could.
Sure. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Quickly, Sheriff Adams.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here.
Morning. Tom Alban.
Present.
Dr. Anderson.
Here.
Dr. Arlato.
Here.
Karen Bailey.
Here.
Coach Bell. I think I see Coach Bell joining. I think his audio is just coming online. Megan Berger.
Present.
Right. Claire Corbell.
Here.
Excuse me. Dr. Coleman. Delegate Ebersol. Dave Engel.
Here.
Good morning. Pam Gaddy. Captain Herring. Dr. Hoover.
Here.
Chief Kiefer. Chief Kiefer? No, I think I see you on. No. I believe, Sam, you're on for the senator?
Hi, yes, that's correct. Something came up last minute this morning, so here I am.
Good morning. Laurel Moody?
I'm here.
Lee Oppenheim?
Good morning.
Secretary Padilla?
Good morning. I'm here.
Good morning. Manfred Reek?
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. Detective Smith? And Nick Shockney will not be on today, I don't believe, unless he joined us last minute. Scott Tippin
I'm here.
and Andrew Tress.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome all. I count 16. Is that right, Dawn? And do we have a quorum?
Yes, you have a quorum. Sorry.
No. Thank you so much for confirming. I appreciate that. So we have a quorum, so let's get, we'll continue to move forward. The agenda went out to everybody. You've had a chance to take a quick look at it. Are there any additions or changes suggested for today's agenda? And I will look for, I'm going to pull up my participant list. I'll look for hands. If anybody has anything to share or suggestions regarding today's agenda. Not seeing anybody, could I have a motion to approve and move forward with today's agenda as printed and distributed?
So moved.
So moved. That was Mr. Albin. Thank you, Tom. And second?
Second, this is Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon, very much. Second, any discussion? Not hearing or seeing any. I appreciate that. All those in favor of moving forward with the today's agenda, please signal by saying aye.
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 Fantastic. Thank you all. Let's move forward with the agenda. Kate, everybody, we had lots of good input over the last couple of weeks to the questions that were sent out. Thank you for doing that. I know I got some feedback from some of the superintendents as well as folks from their various worlds. And so let's talk a little bit about those gaps and needs.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, as Dr. Arlotto mentioned, we received quite a few gaps and needs, observations related to gaps and needs. So just as a reminder, the request from the sub-cabinet was for the advisory board to identify these gaps, come up with recommended solutions if there are any, and then identify ways to measure the success of those recommendations. So we're right here. We're in the November 2021 meeting. So right now we're going to be discussing the gaps and needs that you all observed and identified, as well as start to discuss any recommendations that you can come up with today related to these. I want to caveat this by saying this is not, the intention of this meeting is not to identify every recommendation that we can think of, but at least start to get the wheels churning of things that we might be able to do to solve some of these issues related to gaps and needs. We'll focus the December meeting on the refining of some of those recommendations. So any questions before we get started? All right. So each of the slides, as you know, is separated out to what the observation was in our best effort to reword them so that they are clear, understandable, and they fit across the board. So a couple of things for you all as you discuss these. The first request is that you discuss the validity of the observation. Is it in fact a need or a gap? Is it something that should be addressed or could be addressed in the state? And then have a discussion regarding any potential recommendations that you may have to either fill that gap or address that need. So this is an open discussion among your group. We did not identify who actually submitted each of the observations because some of them were actually tied to multiple observations that came in. So I'll leave the floor open to the group for the first identified observation, which is, it is unclear if legislation, actions, and efforts are making improvements in school safety.
Oh, man.
So would anyone agree with this as an observation of a gap or need in the state?
I was going to say, yeah, just looking at that I'm thinking about like our school situation, the safety needs, and I guess those are hard to. It's hard to give you information when nothing happens. And I know with in our particular situation, the best I could say that at our school, when it comes to the safety and everything we're doing, especially with the SRO, stuff like that, having that SRO at school has been huge in diffusing situations very quickly. But there's not really, I don't know if there's stats. I mean, there's no stats on time on that prevention part. But I do agree. I guess it would, if we're doing all this, it'd be nice if we had some kind of data to prove that. But I guess we won't know until after the year's up. I'm not really sure.
And Dawn, I'm sorry, Kate, if I could jump in, I would say, kind of looking at this question, I'm not sure the direction it's going, but I would agree that there is some confusion with where 2 sessions ago, we added a bunch of funding and school safety into the programming. And then last year we wanted to pull all SROs out. So I think in the law enforcement world, at least, that's a little confusing, and it's a little disturbing. Obviously, I know last session, some of you came on and assisted with speaking on the legislation that was in and talked about the needs of SROs and the great jobs that they do in our schools. So I think that is a little bit of a confusing thing to some people. And I know there's a lot of other questions that we're going to get to that tie into that, as far as messaging and where we want resources and things put in the schools and what direction we want to go. But yeah, it would certainly help some of that to be clarified.
Kate, can I jump in?
Yes, Karen.
Okay, so we've talked about this a lot with the Maryland Boards of Education, and what I see happening during the hearings of the legislative session, or when a bill comes up for discussion, is the senator, the delegate, and the staff do not go to the source in order to gather their information. So what I mean by that is they might call, legislative services, or, someone that they know in the county, or an SRO or a parent. But I think what needs to happen is that they need to come back to either the Maryland Center for School Safety, or someone who can speak to what the legislation is and what the impact may have on the schools, and whether it may or may not help. So, and I agree with the other comments that have been made time and time again. I don't think that, and, even if it goes back to the cabinet and it goes through the state superintendent, there's just a lot of let's do this, but yet they don't see the ending impact of it. Or they don't know if we already have items in place that could do the same thing and maybe just need enhancements.
So initially I'm hearing, Karen, a recommendation for legislators to go to, when it relates to school safety legislation, to come to the center to get some questions asked and answered, hopefully, regarding what is currently already being addressed within either the school systems or private and non-public schools. So that's one.
Right.
Okay. Anything else?
Kate, it looks like there's some hands raised.
Oh,
Do you want us to just jump in?
yes, I apologize. I can only see half of the screen. Let me try to adjust here. So I see yours raised. So
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I just didn't want to jump the line. Okay, so just as I saw this, I do think as a data person, this observation, at least to me, indicates that perhaps the data metrics aren't clear as to what we mean by school safety, or if they are, maybe they're not being communicated to everyone in the way that needs to be communicated. And that seems to resonate with some of the comments that were already made. There's some clear ideas about what the districts and maybe the state mean by school safety, but whether the legislation and actions and efforts are actually leading to those metrics may not be measured well. And even if it is, it doesn't seem that it's being communicated well enough. And I would say it would be great if we did, if it is laid out somewhere, kind of what we mean by school safety. And I imagine that it has been laid out, but I don't know if it's somewhere that everybody has access to.
okay. Delegate Ebersol? See your
Thank
hand.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, and we've talked about legislators, so I'm going to stand up and not stand up for us at the same time. I think the very first thing that we need to be sure of is the Safe to Learn Act, School Safety Act, called for reporting from various local jurisdictions. It's great that we call for it, but the question is are they doing it? We can't really compile information if it's not being done on a somewhat equal basis. And so I haven't looked into this, but before we get clear, we have to have information on incidents and things like that at schools and make sure. I do know that in other situations, I've seen school systems respond with varied veracity on things like this. And so it's important for us it's interesting because who's watching the watchers here? How do we coerce or request or kind of get the schools to do the reporting that's called for in that law? And then I think the other thing that's really important, and you brought this, my original point was that, and then when I was listening to people talk, is that legislators will frequently go to the Department of Legislative Services or the Office of Information Services to get information first, because they don't know this group exists, or they don't know if their specific requests would be able to be gotten from the Center for School Safety. So it's important for those information services for legislators to know that they can refer us also, and to encourage them to either get the information for us from them, from you, from us, or to say, somebody in DLS says, well, you should really contact the Center for School Safety on this. This is where you get this information. So I think a little culture there that they would be willing to defer or at least refer in those cases.
All right, hands, Claire.
From all of the points I'm hearing, depending on what we decide to do in terms of how we collect this data to ensure how these efforts are occurring and how this legislation is impacting, I'm not quite sure how we would do that, but a suggestion for a possible recommendation once we figure out how to do that is making this accessible on the MCSS website. I know for me, I represent students and they really love the format of the website. They like being able to access the different information points, all the resources that are available. So I think once we figure out a way to solve this issue and to collect those data metrics, depending on what everybody says, I think having a page on the website would probably be the easiest way to make this information available to the general public. So that's just the suggestion I have in terms of how we would promote it out there and make sure it's available once we figure out how to necessarily measure how legislation is impacting things around the state.
So Claire, just for clarification, so all the data that we collect, we actually do post on the website. So are you recommending or making a recommendation for maybe a consolidated one-stop shop for data metrics?
Yes, sorry, I meant to clarify that. Yes, I am aware it is posted there, but I think just having more of it there in a concise location and having it promoted more through the homepage at least would probably be the best course of action. So it's more available and able to be easily accessed.
Okay, thank you. Megan?
Kate, can I ask a clarifying question for Claire? Just basically, you just said, so I'm trying to take notes from what everybody's saying. So there are certain pieces of data that relate to this topic, but they belong to MSDE, right? And they might be on MSDE's website separately. Are there things like that that you think belong tied to the center's data?
Yes, I think that is a good point. I think a lot of those things tie in together. So perhaps a way on the website, if these metrics are being posted on the MSDE website, where you're able to link it to the MCSS website. So from a page you go to, you were able to get it through there. So it is in the location if it has to be posted on the other website. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Megan?
Thanks. So I agree with Dr. Hoover in terms of sort of looking at a broader definition of school safety, including school climate and, social, emotional, and different pieces of that. And I also, I know we've talked about this before, but not only considering a broader definition of school safety, but making sure that we're actively seeking input from a broader group of the community. So I know, we talked about maybe reaching out to the special education citizens advisory committees and a broader, really trying to reach out to a broader group of students, both geographically, and in all ways to make sure that not only are we looking at a broader definition of school safety, but we're trying to be as inclusive as possible and seeking input from the community and the schools and school staff and teachers and everybody that's sort of involved to get input on school safety.
And do you have any thoughts on ways we could do that? In other words, expand sort of the information and data collection beyond even the public schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, is figuring out an effective way to seek that input. I know, Kate, you and I sort of, briefly talked about maybe trying to get a survey question on some of the surveys that MSDE puts out to different stakeholders and stakeholder groups, but yeah, that would be, that's certainly the challenge, is figuring out how to reach out and to do so in a way that will, reliably get input from the community.
Coach Bell?
So I just want to be, get clarified. Are we talking about school safety? Are we talking about school safety as it reflects to the SROs? Because school safety can also be a climate of the environment the school is located in too. So when we talk about situations when you have a lot of outside situations coming into the school, are we counting that part of it, or are we saying these schools that have SROs, their safety seems to be here, schools without SROs doing this? I just want to make sure, are we connecting the two, or is it just overall school safety?
So this particular observation that came in was not directly tied to SROs. It was not, it could address SROs, or it could address another portion of the legislation or other actions and efforts that are taking place, not just in public schools, but in non-public special education facilities, private schools. So I think this one was one of those overarching comments or observations. Does that help? All right, any other comments or input on this one? I see a few hands. Megan, your hand is still up, or is that?
No, sorry, I have to take it down.
Okay, and then Lee, I see your hand.
Yeah, one thing I think there's a gap, and we've talked about this a lot, Kate, is it's the education of what the different types of schools are. And so we all know what the public schools are, but legislators and probably a number of people on this committee alone don't understand what a special education, non-public special education school is. And then you have your other non-publics, which are your private schools. So being able to define the different types of schools, as well as the different levels of school safety that we're looking to get matrix on, is probably our first starting point.
So just trying to put this in. So thinking about the information portion, in other words, the understanding of the different schools types, your recommendation is that would be a step one in the process. Just so that in general, people understand that there's more than just public schools in the state.
And taking it the next step is just the information of what the matrix are that we're trying to collect. Because how one school understands it and a school system understands it are very different.
Great, thank you. Karen?
Yeah, I just want to agree with the last speaker. I completely agree with her on that. I don't think that the legislators, and I'm not pounding on them, but you know, I agree. I think the different types of schools need to be defined. And whether that's just an educational piece or to Delegate Eversol's points, you know, the point of contact for most of the legislators are people within those state house buildings, and it is, you know, legislative services. So I don't know if we need to make sure that the Maryland Center for School Safety is kind of on their radar. So when items regarding education or school safety or anything like that come through, that they look at this group, meaning the Maryland Center for School Safety, as a resource that they go to, because sometimes they do go directly to MSDE, and sometimes MSDE just doesn't know because they don't, you know, they're not involved in as much as, or in this aspect of school safety as, you know, this group is. So I think that's an excellent point. You have to begin almost an educational process, because there are so many different aspects to school safety, and cover the whole gamut within the resources that the legislators use.
Great, thank you. Secretary Padilla?
Sorry for that. I do agree with everything that has been said thus far. I also want to say that it's very difficult to come up to a conclusion that the actions, the legislation, and the efforts are not making any impact without a base. I think when we first started this journey, we didn't outline what metrics we were going to use, what was our base to then say whether we're making an impact and is improving school safety. If we had to probably stop and rethink how I go about that, I recommend that we do that, because numbers tell the story, so we need to come up with some way to capture that, so we can then moving forward saying whether we're being making an impact or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Any other input or comments on this observation? All right, I'm going to move to the second. We have quite a few today, so we'll try to get through these. So the second is a need for more focus, and I think we discussed some of this, on upstream approaches to school safety and greater consideration of the possible negative effects of physical safety measures, including security technology and personnel. So first, any comments on this? And then second, any recommendations to address this?
Okay, can we just define what we mean by upstream approaches so everybody's on the same page for that?
Sharon?
I can jump in.
I believe was yours, right?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you, but we use the term typically to describe mental health or other efforts that are preventing safety concerns or promoting positive outcomes, so moving kind of upstream, moving earlier, instead of being reactive. So I'm assuming that's how it would be defined here. And I guess just since I have the floor for a moment, my question on this would just be, are we measuring the possible negative impact of some of the physical safety measures? So I know we just mentioned metrics in the last observation, and I'm wondering, are there metrics to actually take a look at the perhaps unintended negative consequences. I know there's been a lot of discussion around SROs in particular, but also just, there's some data, out of RAND and others looking at other security measures in schools and the potential negative outcomes of those.
And you're referring specifically to the physical.
Well, it could be really any, but here, just in this particular observation, any of the physical safety measures, both security, technology, and personnel. And that could include, impact on perceived safety, but also, disproportionate discipline referrals, for example, with the presence of security technologies and security personnel.
So this ties, I think, to what Secretary Padilla was mentioning, which is, do we have a baseline to start from to determine if there's, at least in Maryland, if there's any negative or positive impacts of physical security? Coach Bell?
So is this something, I'm making sure I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but are we talking, if a school tries something physically, brings in a technology, we should do a report on that one, and that report should be made public for everybody to actually see how it affected that school to see if it works. I know they tried metal detectors in our school, and there was a lot of issues. It had nothing to do with safety and security. It was really more of how long it took to get students in, and the fact that now we're giving every student a laptop. So how do you not detect laptops? That's something we could put out there, have it print, have everybody have access to it. So if another school thought about trying, they could read these like, all right, here's the issues by trying to bring in this particular technology. We got to figure out, can we deal with that? Can we work around that? That's what I'm assuming that's what we're talking about.
So a lot of the civil rights arguments against some physical safety measures include that students actually feel less safe and that there are more expulsions and suspensions, particularly for Black and Brown students. And when those technologies and personnel are put in place, and so a question would be, in Maryland, are we measuring that?
I just wanted to add that in talking to the school-based health providers through MASBAC, the students that they know who have behavioral health issues, the vast majority of the influence on the behavioral health issues are things happening in their community. It's not necessarily stuff that's happening in the school. And I think that was their emphasis on upstream intervention, was to try to help those kids earlier on, because if a kid wants to do something at the school, at that point, it's probably too late to ensure everyone's safety. And so I think that was kind of what at least they were coming from, is trying to address that earlier. So we're not trying to protect people the last possible second before harm occurs. Just as thought.
I think I would only add that I'm having a hard time trying to think about what kind of data can be collected and analyzed regarding physical safety. So in terms of the schools, it is our SROs, but we have increased use of cameras around our buildings. We're building security vestibules. And so some of those around our portable classrooms, we're building fencing and key entry points for students and staff. So I'm not sure how to collect data on some of those physical safety changes, so physical safety measures that we are utilizing and to see if they're working, or as you say, using upstream, is it earlier and proactive that we're seeing any effects of this on our students?
Those are, I think, great examples of, when something like that, when those measures are put in place, does it actually have an impact? And it's hard to tease apart, right? Especially when you're doing multiple things at one time. So your point is really well taken. I think some of the data that is out there does look at not only kind of the specific outcomes of suspensions, expulsions, discipline, threat, but also student perceptions of safety, family perceptions of safety, staff perceptions of safety. And much of the data, again, that is made in the civil rights arguments are that they don't actually, those measures that we're talking about don't actually increase perceptions of safety and don't have an impact on the actual metrics of incidents that occur in a school. And so it'd be important if we are investing in those technologies and personnel that we're collecting that data.
Any other comments or input on this one? Excuse me.
I think just another sort of big bucket concern, with respect to this, with this category is just student privacy and how all the increasing security technology and surveillance and all of the things that are on students' Chromebooks, just making sure that we're really considering student privacy, because I know that that's a really big bucket concern.
So would it be valuable, as you all put together your observations and recommendations for the sub-cabinet, that the advisory board come up with sort of what those overarching buckets might be to include student privacy? Karen?
I guess maybe, and I think I'm going to go to Dawn on this about what are the rights to student privacy before we start building parameters around them. I'm not going to argue that they don't have any, but for instance, if I have a school issued computer, then what are the rights and responsibilities of the school system to make sure that the content that they are accessing or what they are, posting or doing even within their classroom group chats indicate that, they are safe or that they don't need, additional assistance in any way. So, we use a software tracking device that pulls out, specific phrases or items that we are notified if a student is talking about self-harm or talking about, abuse or something like that. So, even though we're monitoring them, it's not in a bad way or to punish them, but it's also to help them. So I think we might need to have some, just clarification on what the schools can and cannot do in relation to student privacy.
So in the group chat, I posted a link to what is now defunct, but it was the Maryland Student Data Privacy Council, which was authorized, I think it was for like a 2-year period by the General Assembly. And that was to help implement the Student Data Privacy Act of 2015. They have concluded their work and issued their report. I'm sorry, I don't know the contents of it off the top of my head, but it is publicly available. So with respect to the issue of quote unquote privacy and what your rights to privacy are within the school's context, there are two sort of separate legal considerations that typically come up when people are talking about students and privacy. One is the more traditional Fourth Amendment style privacy. And you really don't have a privacy right in that sense within the school building. There's case law here in Maryland about what you put in your notices about, lockers and stuff like that, and that you're able to search the premises whenever. So they don't really have a physical privacy right within the school setting, in terms of their belongings and their stuff that they've kept in the school's lockers. Those are the school's lockers. They are not their lockers, that kind of a thing. With respect to digital privacy, which is a separate and somewhat more complicated issue, the question becomes like use of technology systems. And in that sense, the way that those policies are typically phrased for the student use of electronic devices that are issued by the school or use of and access to the school systems are akin to what we would have in the workplace, which is, again, like, this is not my laptop. This laptop that I am on belongs to the state of Maryland. I don't have a privacy right with respect to my use of this, this particular computer, and that is communicated to everyone. The other issue is whether or not data or clicks or something that the student is doing is being tracked or accessed by a third party who is a software as a service provider to the student. And there is federal law related to that, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and there are separate agreements that are always entered into or dealt with by the school systems, and each individual school system has to negotiate for their procurement of whatever platforms they're using for that. But I know that particularly with respect to students, they typically, whatever is or isn't accessed, the software provider is the pass through between the school system and the student using, and not taking or capturing data related to that, other than to help, update programs to assist with the functionality of the software itself, not for marketing purposes. They can't market to the students. So I hope that helps.
Secretary Padilla?
Thank you. Thank you, John. That was very informative. When I read this observation, I'm thinking everything that we do is geared toward the environment that we want the students to have, right? That climate that we want the students to have. Hand on with the school safety for the employees too. But I don't think we as a group have agreed on an assessment on how are we going to ask the student, how do you feel about coming to school now? I mean, a year into it, 2 years into it, perhaps we want to consider that. I'm not a big fan of surveys, to be honest, but maybe we're going to need something like that to identify whether we're accomplishing what we need to accomplish. I do agree with the upstream approach, thinking more on the mental health as I believe Sharon had mentioned, because it does have a very negative impact on their safety environment. And I think there has been a lot of focus on the physical safety, the SROs and all that. And perhaps we want to kind of enhance our focus on the other side that is being as negative as physical safety has been. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Coach Bell?
I know we're talking a lot about students here. I just want to ask this question. Are we taking into consideration the actual employees of the school, especially like the building service workers, or even the safety security, if they feel like they're getting the backing to do what they have to do when it comes to, preventing altercations or removing students from class, or even the student teacher who's teaching the class, are they feeling safe that if something happens in their class, that they will get the backing to get the student out of there so they can continue teaching, or will they be concerned? Because that's going to affect, just jobs itself, people leaving schools because they don't feel safe, or people not wanting to come work at those schools because they don't feel safe. So I'm just looking at when it comes to I'm thinking about the building service workers who come there and they clean up the hallways. Those are normally your local people, local community members that are working at the building. And that's a huge impact on when they leave and go back to the community and talk about if that school feels safe or not. We might want to, consider, just like you were talking about, how they might feel about some of the technologies that we're using. Do we feel that technologies are directed towards one single race? Well, I mean, those building service workers are going to preach that.
Claire?
I think the biggest thing I'm hearing in all of these comments and reading this observation is tackling the root of the problem and preventing things from occurring. In terms of like the possible negative effects of physical safety measures, I think we need to determine more of the specifics as to what certain people are seeing within schools, whether that be students, parents, teachers. I think it would be worthwhile to possibly survey. I agree with that idea, the specifics of that, because I feel like the more we dive into this and get specifics on the root of these issues, which is what I'm hearing in all of this discussion, and again, reading this prompt, the more specific we'll be able to be, and the better we'll be able to address the issues beyond just this general topic of physical safety measures. I think we have to get more specific and have to focus on the prevention aspects of this observation.
Other comments or input on this particular observation? All right, I'm going to move on to the next. The development or expansion of informational practices to educate students on concerning behaviors of their peers. Claire?
I'll just start off by kind of giving a little bit of experience that I've had within the student focus group, because we've had several presentations like this where students have responded really positively to an adult personnel in a specific area coming in and giving a presentation. For example, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with who Candace Yoder is, but when she came in last year and gave a presentation on suicide prevention, a lot of students were able to take those resources back to their schools and distribute those throughout, and we're able to get a lot of great feedback from their specific areas. So I think by focusing on this, perhaps creating presentations that students or parents or personnel can bring back to specific schools to present to a large group, I think that would be really beneficial. Talking to the student focus group and getting suggestions, this was a big one they were concerned about. They wanted specific presentations to be available statewide and were easily accessible. So I think this is a big one that we need to focus on.
Scott?
I was just going to say that I agree that this is important because peers are probably going to know a lot more about what the other students are thinking about than maybe even their parents do. Peers talk to each other about things that they aren't comfortable talking to adults about. I think the other thing that's probably equally important is that students understand like the school systems or the broader systems response to these disclosures, because students might think, oh, my friend's going to get in trouble or my friend's going to get suspended or whatever, and that may influence their comfort level with disclosing some of these things they're concerned about to adults. So I just wanted to flag that as maybe equally important part of educating students.
Sharon?
Just to piggyback a little bit, I think on a recommendation on this side, we have a pretty good program. I'm sure other counties do this as well, where we have our youth leadership academies where there's several students selected from each school. They come together. We take a week where different speakers come in and talk about different, all kinds of different topics and risky behaviors and different things. And the kids also talk about it from their school perspectives. They actually make PSAs, video PSAs. So we partner with some other or local college and things to help them get these produced. They go out to all the schools when we do this Youth Leadership Summit, and they also go on local television programming throughout our county so everybody can see the work that they did and the good job that they did. And it identifies, again, some of the needs and some of the peer behaviors that I think this is addressing or talking about. And it's always good to have these youth leaders from each school go back and try to get that disseminated through the whole school climates. And it's worked really well here. So that's, again, I'm not sure that that's happening everywhere, but it's just something that's gone over pretty well here.
And Scott, does that expand beyond the public school system?
I don't believe so. That's a good question. But as I'm thinking through, because I've spoken at several of these, and I do not believe, I think it is just our public schools, but it should be expanded for sure into the private schools as well.
Okay, so I'm hearing this is definitely a need, something we need to address. And Scott, Tiffin, just to make sure I'm clear on your two-sided recommendation. It's one, it's not just the identification or teaching students how to identify behaviors of concern in their friends or that their friends might be exhibiting, but also making sure they understand what sort of response is going to come out of that if in the event they report something to someone.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then
okay.
So they're comfortable, and also so no one's surprised. I think that's, can hurt students' trust down the road if they're surprised by the response.
Right. Oh, thank you. Sharon?
And maybe this goes without saying, but I just want to make sure that concerning behaviors that we're talking not just about threatening behaviors, but also aligned with our discussion of upstream thinking, kind of how do we ensure that peers are identifying emotional and behavioral health concerns that could lead to threat down the road, perhaps, and that they are also equipped, that peers are also equipped with information about how to support help seeking in their peers. And there's a lot of good programs happening now in Maryland already in this area. So just growing those perhaps.
Great, thank you. Detective Smith?
Yes, ma'am. I really think that it is a need for expansion, and because, like you said, when we're talking about, children need to feel safe. They need to make sure that a lot of kids go unnoticed, and a lot of them want good things to happen. They don't want the negative behavior, so they just really need to know if they can reach out and go to some adult, that they will be heard and they will understand what's going on. I was just saying this, that a lot of things is getting worse. It's because they're not knowing what's going to happen if they tell or come forward. So that is something that really needs to be developed and expanded in that sense.
Thank you. Sharon, did you have another point? Okay.
No, sorry, I'll put my hand down.
Claire?
And I think a really easy way to promote this, depending on what we come up with in terms of a presentation, is perhaps making this a requirement of the school certifications. I know that was a program that was introduced last year with the gold, silver, and bronze. I think that would be a really valuable way to get this out there, because I was trying to brainstorm ways where students across the state, not just specific groups like the student focus group, would be exposed to this material. So I think that is a really easy way to promote it. Once that program gets off and running, which I know it already has perhaps making that a requirement for students to listen to a 30-minute presentation from an MCSS personnel based upon what we come up with to address this need. I think that would be a really easy way to promote it.
Okay, thank you. Any other input or comments on this one? All right. So I think we've all seen this. It's been a tough year and a half. So the impact of COVID on students and staff is evident. Need more student and staff supports to identify behaviors of concern, de-escalate behaviors, and provide resources to re-engage and strengthen both the school, the community, students, parents, and staff relationships, basically creating a culture of civility. Any comments or input on this? Detective Smith?
I guess I'll dive in. Yeah, I think that that's one thing that went unnoticed when we talked about when we opened up schools. I don't think that, a lot of folk didn't pay attention to the impact that COVID would have had on students coming back into school after 18 months. So the impact that we see on our students, like we said, is statewide. It's not just here in the city. It's not in just certain towns or certain counties. The impact that we're seeing that COVID has had on our students around the state it's been a big thing. So we got to get back to building those relationships with these young folk and teachers. It affected teachers, it affected administrators, it affected everyone that's working in schools. So we really have to go back and dig and dive in and see how we can get back to getting these young folks back engaged into the learning community and basically, get them, de-escalated back to what COVID did to them so we can have our school environments back to where we need them to be.
Great, thank you, Detective. Dr. Arlotto?
Thank you. I absolutely agree with Detective Smith. This is a significant issue across all the school systems. I have the opportunity at least weekly to talk to my colleagues around the state, and we are all feeling this. We're feeling the pressures of COVID. And I would say it's being compounded as we have returned to school now with full classrooms and hallways and buses, with the fact that we're all down staff. There is just a staffing shortage in almost every job description there is in our school systems, whether it's food service or teachers or TAs or bus drivers. And so everyone is having to pitch in a little bit more to do some things to cover for their colleagues and others and to support the students, that it's really taking a toll on staff as we are trying to meet the needs. And as Detective Smith talks about, building those important relationships. I think every one of my colleagues around the state really knew this was going to be a different kind of school year, and we needed to open school differently, really focusing on the social emotional needs of the students and staff as we return to full in-person learning across the state. And it's really been, I believe, compounded by lack of staffing, where I've had support staff that have been in and out of schools to support them in the past are now teaching in classrooms or teaching online to those students that are quarantined, and they're not available to support schools the way they have in the past. Thanks.
Thank you. Scott?
I was just going to say that one thing also to think about with COVID is that even once everything's back to normal, like on the process level, that some of the behavioral health experiences for some of these students probably will be very, very long lasting. So I just wanted to put out there that like our planning and thinking around the response to COVID probably isn't going to be a 1 year thing. Like some of these kids may have multi-year long difficulties related to some of their experiences.
And likely the staff and faculty as well.
Totally fair. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Tom Alvin?
And I would just add, I think the focus when it comes to COVID needs to be the entire family. Because as we've worked through now, what's our second year, last year was far easier dealing with families and the impact that COVID has when kids are, quarantined or whatnot. And I truly believe a lot of the kids' conduct now is being driven by the example set by their parents. And I think it's just fatigue on everybody's part. But I think to be effective, we need to think of strategies not only to help and assist our students, but also our families as a unit.
And Tom, as a follow-up to Dr. Arlotto's point, are you seeing similar staff and personnel shortages?
Yes, we this year have far more openings, still working, trying to fill some, a lot more long-term substitutes, bringing people out of retirement. So yeah, we're definitely having a similar battle with staffing as well.
James?
Yeah, I wanted to actually piggyback on that one because I got families, I had students that are fine with coming to school, but the families themselves, they're just not sure about the process. They don't know if they trust what's happening at the school because they don't have enough information. Some of it's not because we don't get the information out to them, but once again, we have, you're living with the grandmom, and she doesn't have access to technology. She can't use the computer as well, and she doesn't have the information that we're trying to provide to them to show them this is the type of things we're doing at school, or this is what we're recommending with the mask and stuff. So I have students that are being pulled out and not put in virtual school at all. They're just being pulled out and expected to have work sent home to them because the families themselves do not feel comfortable with what the school is doing. So we definitely have to find a way to reach out with those family members so they can understand that we're going to try to provide the safest environment for your child. And that also goes into, long-term subs, because a lot of them are local community members that now, we can't get sub jobs fulfilled because they don't want to come in because they're not sure what's going on with the school. And they might not have kids actually in the school, so they might not have the information too, as just as being an adult in the community of what we're trying to provide, what we're trying to do to keep everybody safe at the school.
Right, thank you. Sheriff Adams?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what everybody said, and Dr. Arlotto, especially, I was at our SRO meeting last week, which we have monthly with the school system as well, with the leadership teams from the schools. And, everybody is feeling the same staffing issue, the pinch, and especially through law enforcement, as I'm sure you're all aware. I'm sure any law enforcement on here, or you talk to anybody throughout our state or nation, we are struggling mightily to keep staffing in law enforcement side. So it's not to say that, the school safety side is not important to us. It certainly is. But I think somewhat it has taken a little bit of a back burner recently because of, we didn't have students in schools. We didn't talk about this much recently. We haven't seen these tragic events that happen because we didn't have students in school, so they weren't occurring. We've got, not just in school settings, but community settings as well, where we're seeing there is a lot more. It's like, the fun has been sucked out of life for the past 18 months. So, and people being put together, just like in houses, we were seeing some community issues with the COVID effect. Now, as students are back in schools, we're certainly seeing it happen in the schools. And I know the school staffs are stressed about it. We talked about with the SROs, we were going through some of the issues we were seeing in the different schools. And a lot of it you can hear is COVID related and kids trying to re-engage back into the schools and get used to that structure and environment and different things. And there's mental health issues running through all that. So yeah, it is certainly, there's no small statement to say it's creating a huge impact. And I agree that it's not going to be solved in a year. So unfortunately, everybody's working through that issue.
Great, thank you, Scott. Dave?
Hey, Kate. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight the hate bias stuff with schools. As you and I discussed previously, if you look at 2019 numbers, There were 145 incidents reported in academic institutions in Maryland, which was over 30% of all reporting. And then for 2020, COVID hits, we go to distance learning, and that number drops down to 46, which represents about 12%. So we're very keen on, very mindful of, with the in-person learning going on again, to see if we see that immediate spike back up. And I do think that is an area for staff and students to be very mindful of and to be paying extra special attention to. We just didn't see it with the online learning, but certainly being back in person will be interesting to see if we see that uptick again.
Yeah, excellent point. Manfred, you see your hand?
Yes. Yeah, I was just getting back to everyone's reiterating what everyone has already talked about, but I'm responsible for a large staff of bus drivers and attendants, and supporting them and having resources to support their feelings. There's a entirely negative, there's a negative perspective about what's going on with how they're being treated with regards to vaccinations and things like that. So the staff is up in arms about how they are being treated. And so we need to have there are unknown issues that are going to need to be addressed in terms of safety and concerns about how they are supported in the future. It's a challenge that we have across the board, like Dr. Arlotto said, that we have a lot of gaps in terms of resources that are due to a number of things, and COVID has impacted us tremendously in terms of reducing our ability to support our community. All our supervisors who can drive are driving right now.
Thank you, Manfred. Any other comments on this one? All right. So the next observation is a need to continue efforts that communicate the impact of trauma and the need for trauma-informed care. So I guess my first question to everybody is this not happening? Are there places this is not happening currently? Manfred, is your hand up for this one or for the last one?
Sorry, that was the last one. I'll take it down.
Okay. Detective Smith?
Yes, I can say that here in the city, I can feel that it's not happening enough. I mean, we deal with a lot of our students who have came back, like I said, after the last 18 months, especially, that have dealt with a lot of trauma that they've seen on the streets with, their peers, especially the high school kids, of friends being shot or murdered, or however you want to put it. And they're coming back, bringing that anger into the schools. And then they expect, a lot of folks are expecting the school counselors and their teachers and administrators to deal with it. So here in the city, we're dealing with that a lot, that I feel that even we don't have enough of the effort to deal with the amount of students that we are dealing with on a daily basis with this trauma, or we got to find a way to want to engage them more or make them want to come and get the care to get it done. But that's what we're dealing with a lot here in the city. Of a lot of our young folks are not getting the proper care that they need after dealing with so much trauma that they're facing, in their daily lives once they leave school.
James?
Yeah, I 100% agree. We had a couple of incidents that happened while we were out of school last year that affected a lot of our students. It is being brought into the school. A lot of the issues we're having right now at our school are from things that happen in the community that's being brought in, and there's not much support. And these are still young people at all the different schools, but there's not. I don't know what the support is out there for them. Obviously, they're not reaching out to get support. So it might be something that we have to find a way to make them feel comfortable about coming in and communicating that so they can sit down and talk. Because we do have a lot of frustrations that have nothing to do with the education system or the school itself, but those frustrations are spilling over into our hallways and something that we're having to deal with after the fact.
Thank you, James. Scott Tiffin?
I was just going to express my strong agreement with this one. Like, I think that a lot of students are having a lot of issues with trauma. And I know there's a greater and greater awareness amongst educators about how important it is to be trauma informed in their classrooms, but teachers can only do so much. You know, they're not behavioral health providers, and they just don't have always the support of the other staff to help those students. For example, you know, we have a huge shortage of school psychologists. You know, I've talked to school psychologists who are working in 3, 4, or even more schools. And so they're in each school for a couple hours a week, and that's it. And that's the only behavioral health provider that's really there to help students in those schools.
Thanks, Scott. Sheriff Adams?
Thanks. Agree 100% on this observation. As far as recommendation, I can just say I know one thing that I've seen a pretty positive effect with, and we need more of everything. But coming out of the SRO meeting and last week we had a presentation from our, make sure I get these titles right, the local care coordinator, team coordinator, so we have a local care team that's funded through our LMB, the local management board. So the local care coordinator works in cooperation with, so we have the Handle with Care program here at Cecil as well. So if we have a trauma event that's police related, we make sure we have email set up and it links right into our school system and our school safety people at the schools, and they make sure to get the information out. We found gaps there as well. So, okay, once we get the information to the school people, what can they do? And again, everybody's short of people. So this local care team gets notified, and they've seen their numbers jump greatly now that schools are back in and kids are back in school. So that's been helpful. We need more of those, but those local care teams and care coordinators work well for us.
Great, thank you, Sheriff. Secretary Padilla?
I have to say, I couldn't be more proud of Scott Adams talking about the local care teams. You know, it shows that when we work together and educate together, we know the resources available in the community so we can better serve the people that we serve. Yes, I just couldn't agree with this more. I've seen it in the kids, the children that we have in our welfare system, and those that we missed during the pandemic because they were home. We don't know what was happening behind the closed doors, and now they're coming back to school, and they're sharing what they experienced with the staff or the teachers, and also we need to be mindful that people are really struggling. Everywhere in all aspects, the struggle continues, and it's going to take a long time for them to create resilience, resiliency to be strong, to overcome everything that has happened and everything that could be coming their way in the future. So as far as recommendation, we need to continue to work together, just as Scott said. The more we know, the more we communicate. In my agency, what we're doing, we're taking a 2-gen approach where we're starting to work with the whole family, recognizing that it's not only the child. We need to be proactive and bring the whole family into the conversation and identify their needs and the resources available to them. And then at some point, we have to agree that we are where we're at in this pandemic because we were all very resilient, right? We were all very determined to come out of the pandemic. So now we need to shift into building then the resiliency that it would be needed to be prepared for the everyday that struggles that we are going to be dealing with now that the pandemic hopefully is coming to an end. Back to you.
Thank you, Secretary. Any other comments or input on this one? All right. So need dedicated funding for more human resources to meet the expanding needs of our students. This includes educators, crisis intervention support, security, mental health, social workers. I think this came up earlier. So any recommended solutions for this outside of finding an entire group of people who can do 7 things at once? Secretary Padilla, did you have a comment on this?
Oh, I 100% support, right? The observation. I think I would like to educate this group for the ones that don't know about the Family First initiative, where there could be federal funding that we can pursue to implement preventive measures to address some of what is said here, right? The goal of the Family First is not to remove children from homes and identify their needs and work, as I said, with the whole family. And that would include almost all the pieces that we're talking here, the crisis intervention, mental health, the social workers, but, and also I would like to see us braiding more of the federal funding. So we could identify, work and identify the resources and fund the need that we have. I totally supported. One of the recommendations is, like I said, the Family First, braiding funding available through the federal government, and also go for grants that could, I can tell you the HHS and ACF would be more than happy to see something coming from Maryland to identify, to work and address this gap.
Great, thank you, Secretary Padilla. Dr. Hoover?
Yeah, so just a recommendation here. I mean, the workforce issue is really significant everywhere across the nation, including Maryland. And so in addition to just having more funding for human resources, if we could build our workforce pipeline efforts, I mean, all the way down to high school, but also through our institutions of higher education, in a way that builds the workforce in all of these areas and does so in a way that's representative of the communities being served. And I would, put specifically in there better workforce development connections with our HBCUs in Maryland. Thanks.
Kelly?
And Kate, this is not within probably our purview to solve, but one of the key things that happens is the lack of funding at the graduate level. A lot of the mental health and social workers, school psychologists require significant graduate level training in order to be an entry level person in the field. And without good funding or, even sort of loan forgiveness for public service kind of options, it's a real barrier to really expanding your diverse work field and really getting enough people. So I realize MCSS is not going to weigh in on graduate funding, but it's a significant barrier to getting people into the field.
Great, thank you. And just because the MCSS won't weigh in doesn't mean it can't be included in recommendations from the advisory board, which filter up to others. So, so thank you for that. Any other comments on this one? All right. So there's a need to expand substance abuse resources and training for students. Coach Bell?
Some of that might have to go beyond students, because part of the issue, I know I've witnessed, with, being raised in the same community I work at now, is that it's their family members that have the substance abuse that's going to the students. So when you go home and it's acceptable for you to do those certain things because your family's not getting the support, that poses an issue. It's hard for us to tell a student not to do it when, they're sitting around the table doing it at home. So it's something that has to be, I think, expanded to the whole family as far as support, or even if the family is not doing it, teaching them techniques to help with understanding that student and help and doing the right things to help that student recover and get away from that kind of stuff.
Okay, this is Laurel Moody. Is it a possibility that we could promote the opioid response training that several jurisdictions are doing? I know families and I certainly have my nursing students completing this training, but in terms of resources that are out there, I know in Baltimore County, they're doing the online opioid response training now since the COVID pandemic. But when we're looking at resources and training, I think every jurisdiction has that program already in place. And would that be a resource to consider to promote for our students to participate in?
Who's the audience of the training?
Well, it was initially set up to be family and friends of people battling substance or opioid use. But now, law enforcement participates, first responders. It's really open to anyone in the public. It's an excellent training opportunity.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments on this observation? Okay. So this is a need to correct false and misleading information, which has the potential to inflame tensions. Also, there are unrealistic expectations regarding what law enforcement and educators can do in response to situations such as community events and social media posts. Secretary PD, I see your hand is up, but I assume that's from the other question or other observation.
Yes, thank you. It is. But I agree. I mean, there's a lot of misleading information, confusing, and it is important that people know that law enforcement has its limitations, and when you come up with community events, it's going to be very difficult for them to respond and at the way that they probably expect them to respond. Some communication campaign would probably help. I don't know, or maybe even in the schools, have a conversation with the parents and the students on when they call for law enforcement, what could they expect, would probably be helpful. That's as far as I can think of right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Scott?
I was just going to say, like, the second part of this prompt, I think, really highlights the discussion we had earlier about the importance of some of the upstream interventions. Because, I think once the law enforcement can only do so much, and educators also, have a lot of different burdens on them. And so I think trying to invest more in preventing these issues before they arise will probably go a long way. Just thought.
Great, thank you. Claire?
With this observation, I see a lot of the same points and questions that are brought up in terms of false and misleading information, especially among students and parents that I've talked to. I think developing a simple Q&A page possibly, or maybe a statewide session would be beneficial. Because again, with this, I see a lot of the same concerns and questions that are brought up. And I think just addressing those in any way we can would probably be the best course of action here.
Thank you, Claire. Dr. Arlotto?
Thank you. I would just add that this is, I think as most of the group knows, our school administrators spend an incredible amount of time on issues that are occurring both in the community and truly in social media. They are constantly having to follow up and deal with social media posts that may very well have never been generated during school time, but they of course involve our students and then could spill over into what's occurring on a day-to-day basis in the school. So maybe the idea of creating some more guidance for our school administrators about how to work through what some of those best practices are, working through students that are dealing with social media. This could occur in bullying and a number of other different areas, but it is an incredible amount of time they are spending in dealing with social media.
Great, thank you, Dr. Arlotto. Any other comments or input on this one, on this observation? All right, moving along. There's a need for online and/or in-person training resources for different positions throughout the school safety community. This includes administrators, security staff, mental health, bus drivers, and general school staff, all needing different levels of training to improve their proficiency and ultimately create an improved culture of safety and security within the schools. That was a mouthful. Comments? James?
Yeah, I 100% agree with this. I know, I think we talked about this a couple of years ago, well before the pandemic. As coaches, we are required to do certain things like concussion protocol and, there's other kind of forms, heat acclimation, but there's other things on there too about, mental support and stuff like that. And they're all listed on the NFHS website for us. They're free. You click on there, you can get on there, you get certificates sometimes because we're required obviously to have a certificate. But there are also things that I share with my students. Some things are as simple as, nutrition. I share that with them, or what vaping can do to you. Those are things I always share with the students, and they're just free things to give to people. I think if we had a available site where people can go and get these things and follow up on them and even have certificates. I don't know how to get rewarded for that, but that would be very helpful when people are a little confused on how to handle certain situations.
Thank you. Any other input on this observation? Okay. So we need there's a need for better clarification, support, and funding to implement standardized school facility vulnerability and safety assessments that incorporate state and federal guidance and best practices. So I think this one may tie to some of our private and non-public schools outside of our, separate from our public schools. Any input or comments there? Coach Bell, did you have a comment or is your hand just up from the last one?
Nope, apologize for that.
Okay. Lee? Lee, you're muted still.
goes back to some of our previous discussions about standardizing across the state. And so everybody, whether it's public school or non-public special education or private school, we're all looking for the same things to make sure that we're addressing the same needs and same vulnerabilities. And I think in talking to our schools, there's definitely a lack of understanding and communication of what the security assessment should be looking at.
Great, thank you. Karen?
I agree with this because I don't think there's a lot of standardization. I think a lot of the LEAs are doing things, meaning safety assessments and things like that based on what their unique situation is. I just want to make the point to everyone, when we keep asking for additional funding, just so everyone understands, a portion of all of the LEA budgets come from the federal government, a portion comes from the state, and then the remaining balance of whatever you need comes from your local county. So the state provides funding just straight based up on a per pupil allocation based on what your enrollment is. So, and in our case, and I'm assuming in most of them, that money's eaten up almost immediately by salaries and benefits for our individuals. So anything additional is going to have to come outside of that, and through the legislature or directly through, through the budget. So just so everyone's clear on how that's working.
Great, thank you, Karen. Any other inputs or comment on this observation? All right.
Kate, I think,
yeah, I got it.
I think that, Karen, I think it all adds back to the same thing. If we're standardized across the board, then it's going to be easier to figure out what funding sources there are than trying to nitpick from county to county or school to school. Just have a standardized level that then legislators and whoever can go out and get funding for. So we hear you because we experience a very similar situation where our funding is based on our kids, and some funding that's available to public schools include our kids that we don't get funding for either. So the standardization, I think, is going to be key to a lot of funding availability.
And Lee, I think this observation here is what ties directly to what you were talking about, right? Is that consistency across public schools, private schools, non-public special education facilities in the state. Tom, representing the private schools, I don't know if you have any input or comments on this.
I think really what I would just add is I think the processes often are so difficult and challenging to implement that, while it's just hard, it's another element to manage. And, it's a matter of then finding contractors to do the target hardening or whatever the enhancements are, or counselors or whatever. So I just think that streamlining as best as possible the processes would be extremely helpful as well. Just because, and I know it's true in public schools as well, but in the non-public sector, our layers of supervision and oversight are much thinner than I think traditionally thought of. So it would just be helpful to just streamline things as much as possible.
Any other comments on this observation? Oops. There we go. This we actually talked about earlier is consistency in data collection and reporting. An example that was given was the arrest data that's collected across school systems. Comments, input? All right, not hearing any, oh, we've got one. Sheriff Adam?
Just quickly, I mean, I agree. I think it's important to have consistent data when you're looking at across statewide to keep things so you're having, you know, apples and oranges and not having apples and oranges when we're doing comparisons. And I know as law enforcement, we talked about this right when we had our meetings on having a statewide use of force. And remember, Kate, how involved that got just to get law enforcement agencies on the same page across the state to have consistent reporting. And as we talked about that is super important for us so that we don't have just misinterpretations, as we talked before about having false and misleading data that we start making decisions based upon when it's not correct. So it is important for us to have consistency when it comes into data collection, because that's where we start looking at having, when we're reporting the legislature or making changes, you want them to be correct changes and not based on inconsistencies. So yeah, it's important. The recommendations are, I don't have great ones other than, you know, we did have a statewide, we do the use of force statewide reporting for school use of force reports. So I know this has been talked about as far as arrest data is concerned. I don't know that it was ever hammered out and everything put into place yet, however.
All right, thanks, Scott. Any other comments or input on this? This one is need consistent emergency planning and preparedness for all schools, including public, private, and non-public special education, to ensure that every student is safe. So again, I think this ties back, Lee, to your earlier comment regarding consistency statewide. And I'm assuming when the group is quiet, that means everyone's in agreement. All right. Small private and non-public schools do not have the resources available to address preparedness efforts, including facility assessments, comprehensive all hazard emergency plan development, training, or exercise. So first question is this a gap? And if this is, or a need, and if this is, how do we address it? Lee?
From talking to both our non-public special education schools and some of the private schools, it's evident that there is a lack of communication and a lack of availability of these resources, and everybody is trying to reach out to each other for assistance. Montgomery County has started meetings for the non-public or private school community. They've tried to help reach out in a number of different ways, but even attending some of those workshops that they run, there are schools that don't even know where to start from. And so getting assistance to get people on the same, at least to the page, never mind on the page, is something that we need to consider.
Any additional input? All right. Small private and non-public schools need more assistance collaborating with local responders and identifying family notification or reunification centers within their communities. So I assume this is in fact a need of the small private or non-public schools. So I guess my question is, what would be the recommendation here to address that?
Okay, this, I didn't put my hand up, so I apologize, but I would just say that it is a challenge for at least the small private non-public schools, to the extent that, you know, many of us don't have standing relationship with law enforcement, such as SROs on site. So it does make it much more challenging. And I think, you know, one thing that would very constructive that would be helpful is almost to formulate simple contact lists. For example, you know, we had a recent incident just the end of last week in one of our schools where, due to the nature of it, you know, it was extremely helpful, you know, because the center actually provided to us some good context given the nature of the situation in the local law enforcement agency. So we knew who to go to. So I think, you know, really helping us just identify, you know, who are the key players for the public schools that we could hopefully then, you know, extend that partnership. And yeah, I think that's a big one. And again, another continuing challenge has always been notification when there's an incident in the community. And I know that that varies even within and across the public school sector, but we've had a number of incidents where we've had things occur very close to our schools where we have no notification of it, yet we learn later that through whatever the process was, the public schools were provided notification and put into lockdown, whereas we never received similar notification. So, you know, somehow trying to foster a relationship where the small private non-public schools are brought into that queue of what the notification processes and whatnot.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Any other input on this observation? Okay. Need to better integrate mental health into school curriculum and have mental health supports expanded in schools. Claire?
I just want to really strongly emphasize this point. Just speaking around the state with the student focus group and other students I'm with, and with personal experiences I've had, students are really struggling with mental health coming back from virtual school and struggling with the changes that COVID-19 has presented to them. And a complaint that a lot of people have is that the mental health curriculum available in schools is not sufficient enough to provide students with the resources they need to be successful and to implement into their own lives. They feel like the resources that have been provided in their counties were really emphasized during COVID-19. But once we came back to school this year, they know they're there. They just haven't been promoted as much. So I think their biggest hope, and a lot of students, at least that I've heard of, is an expansion of these resources and an understanding of what students feel about this issue. They want their input to be heard. So when we address this, I'm really hoping that we're able to utilize that voice.
Great, thank you, Claire. Sharon?
Yeah, so agree with Claire. And I was going to share in the chat box a report that came out from Mental Health America recently, where they did talk about other states, Florida, New York, Virginia, that have legislated around the integration of mental health into the school curriculum. And they provide some really nice examples of how to better do that at the policy level. So I'll go ahead and share that. But I do think thinking about kind of statewide policies that could improve mental health literacy for staff and students could be really critical.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Kelly?
Yeah, Kate, this is just a quick aside, and again, not totally under the purview of MCSS, but one thing to think about when we talk about expanding mental health supports in schools is that we also need the space to put the people that we bring in. What we're finding is that even as grants are being awarded for social workers or more school psychologists or whatever, we don't have the appropriate workspace for them. And so trying to do trauma-informed counseling in the corner of the teacher's lounge, which is also where the copier is not really an appropriate place. And so I think just remembering that it's both people, but spaces to work in are two real components of that.
Great, good point, thank you. Coach Bell?
I'm glad she said that because I was going to tap in that we don't have, I always go on the after school programs that could integrate mental health within the programs, and we don't have those set up. Especially at a time where I think some of our students probably need to be away from the community and more at the school, or at least on campus, more than ever. And knowing this is where your help is, this is where your safe zone is, but we're not providing programs for them to stay at school or stay on campus. So now they go home and they have to deal with situations over and over and over again.
Great, thanks, James. Karen?
I just have one quick comment. I agree with everything that's been said. I don't think we make the appropriate space allocations in our schools for mental health. From the flip side, and to Claire's point, with that some of the students don't feel as if the mental health resources are communicated to them, and maybe I misunderstood, but is part of the problem that we are all adults that are trying to push out services, and we are not clearly using the same platform that the high school and middle school students are. I mean, I have a middle schooler and I have a high schooler, and she is not in the same realm of social media that a 40 or 50 or even 30-year-old person is. So maybe that's part of the issue too that we need to focus on is, make sure that we're communicating them in the, in the space that you guys are all using.
If I could just hop in here for a second and reply to that, I completely agree with you. I think the best resources that I have seen that have worked within my own county and through state student council is the resources that students are a part of making. I love when student input is valued. I know students appreciate that as well. And I think they have the most say in terms of this issue because they're the ones being impacted by that. So I think if their input is heard, that's where the best resources will come out of. And when you connect those two, when we work together, that's where the best resources are developed. So I appreciate you saying that.
Great, thank you. Any other input? All right. A big gap exists between safe school buildings and safe communities. Many students live in communities where they're experiencing or witnessing serious violence. There is also a lack of supportive after-school programs in some areas. Coach Bell, I think that ties directly to what you had just said. So for this is getting our after-school resources back up and running and doing it at a platform that our students participate in. James?
Yeah, and just what Karen was talking about, tying in those programs so that they carry over. I go back to the after-school program I was in when I was in school that was called Bright Futures. It was in middle school, and it addressed middle school issues and middle school support. But then as soon as I got to high school, Bright Futures was still there, but it was in a different format addressing high school issues and high school support. Now, we didn't have social media back then, but at the same time, we could be doing those same things when we have a similar program that carries over by name, making the student feel very safe and familiar with the program, but that program also addresses the issues that happens at the current school that they're at. And I think that's very important. I have a hard time having a conversation with one of my students about what you shouldn't do and who you shouldn't hang out with, when the reality situation is as soon as they get off the bus, they have to walk by those very people to get back to their house. And they have to, you know, if they want to come out in their neighborhood in the weekend, they have to be around those very people I'm trying to tell them not to be around. So I would love to get those programs back in the system and the support. And I know we have the teachers that would love to be part of that.
Great, thank you, Coach Bell. Any additional input? There's a need for additional funding for physical security upgrades, replacement and additions on buses and schools, includes cameras, fencing, access control system, and vestibules. Is there a gap here or a need here? Karen?
I think that's gonna come down to the individual LEAs and, you know, how they've managed their budget and what they've done over the, you know, over the past several years, you know, to beef up the physical security in their building. So I don't know if it's a, you know, if it's a blanket comment or if it's, you know, make funding available for those who still have gaps based on what, you know, what the standard is or should be.
Thank you. Manfred?
Yeah, I was puzzled by this a little bit too, in terms of gaps for security on the bus. Buses have cameras generally now. The only thing we don't always have, and Baltimore County is one of these schools systems that doesn't have it, is stoplight cameras. So funding for that would be, you know, helpful, of course. But we do have camera security. I don't know if there's any, whoever wrote this had any concern about having access control to getting on a bus. But other than that, just the stoplight camera is the only concern I see now as a need.
Manfred, stop light or the stop arm cameras?
Stop arm camera.
Okay.
I mean, when the stop sign comes out, to capture people driving by.
Great,
which
thank you.
happens all the time.
Yes, it does. Too often. Tom Alvin?
I would just add two things, and certainly funding is always a good thing. I think there are certainly a number of funding opportunities out there, whether it's through the state, federal, or other granting organizations. I think the challenges really, again, come down to process. And the other big issue with a lot of these funding opportunities, if you will, at least in the private and non-public school sector, the funding is an after fact. And what I mean is you have to put the money out and then get it back. And the big concern with many of our schools is they don't have the financial wherewithal to pay that money up front. And there's particularly always a hesitancy that what if we don't, you know, cross all our T's and dot all our I's and we don't get that money back. You know, we can't afford to absorb that. So I don't know, maybe some sort of reevaluation of the structure where maybe it's more of a matter that the funding is actually provided in good faith. And then if the recipient fails to implement whatever the grantee had understood was being purchased or acquired, if they don't provide proof of that, then it would be reimbursement of the money. So I would just add that I think there are plenty of opportunities out there. It's just, again, process and then actually the financial wherewithal to fund it up front.
Great, thank you. Sheriff Adams.
Thanks. Just really quickly, as far as the stop arms go, there are private companies out there. I don't want to drop names. You can do your research that fund that for you. We're actually in the process with the school system here in cooperation with us, the sheriff's office, starting that up right now. I know several other counties use it already, where, you know, they do all that for free. They install, they put all the equipment on, and outside of just having the stop arm cameras, which helps with violations of, you know, cars running school bus lights, they'll also put additional communication devices on those buses that you can have communication with your police, you know, police agencies and dispatch centers and the like. So that's a valuable resource that you might want to look at if you're not already using that. And I'll tell you this, as far, we did some preliminary numbers. So as we got all those cameras installed, and we ran a week of them a couple weeks ago just to see what the violation numbers were. And we had, in our county, we had 93 violations in that 1 week. So it's happening a lot more than you would ever imagine that it's happening. So we're going to have our media push here soon that we're going live with this. And so there's companies out there that will assist you with that. As far as that's just the school bus and stop arm cameras.
Thanks, Scott.
Sure.
Thank you, Scott. Lee?
I totally agree with what Tom was saying. The other issue is that over the last few years, the amount of the funding sources, even though they're reimbursable, the limit on the amounts has started to decrease. Yeah. And when you're a small school and you're trying to get a project done, you're looking to multiple different areas to get funding. And so it just makes the concern about being able to get reimbursed even greater now.
Any additional input? Okay. There's limited school security funding of grants available for smaller school systems. I think we just spoke to some of that. So there may be more resources available, but there might need to be changes in the process for how those funds are distributed. Anything else on this one? All right. Sheriff Adams already has his hand up for this one. So the SRO grant does not allow agencies to hire. Funding cannot be used for other purposes. And the allocation form in the statute only provides $7,000 per public school.
Actually, my hand was up. I just didn't lower it last time, but I will speak to this really quickly. I know we're short on time, but this is something I know, Kate, you and I have talked a lot about. I know there are issues with the grant and how this runs, and a lot of agencies cannot take advantage of that for a multitude of reasons of the way that it's written and the way supplanting comes into play, and the way the timing of how the money comes out to when the timing of how long it takes us to hire somebody and how all that works. So we really do need to deep dive into how that can better be structured to where it's going to be more useful to more agencies, because I think it definitely hinders. I don't know the exact numbers on who takes advantage of this, but I know it's lower than what it could be because of the restrictions and the way it's structured. So yeah, that is a problem.
Any additional comments on this or input? Okay. There's a limited capacity to provide students with a continuum of community-based interventions that support positive behavior, particularly if those students have been justice involved or currently under DJS supervision. So DJS is in there. Andrew, I don't know if you want to speak.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's sort of tied into a lot of what's been discussed in terms of going back to the trauma-informed care and just providing those services and identifying those youth sort of with the most needs early on. You know, it's when they come to us, we can provide services outside and link them with resources in the community, particularly in the community has been a big trend in the last few years, but it's sort of reactionary once they come to us. So it would be better if they maybe just continuation of sharing resources earlier on, and identifying youth that may have high needs earlier on to link them with other resources in the community.
Great, thank you. Any additional input? I think we're very close, if not near the end. So this came in toward the end of last week. So need to review and update bullying and harassment reporting forms. I was not sure if this was specific to the state level forms or if it was forms that the LEAs have.
Kate, I think it's more geared towards the state reporting form. And then how we at the local levels are trying to collect the data and then fit it to the form.
Were there any recommended solutions outside of just going back and looking at sort of how it's structured and figuring out ways to refine it?
Not specifically, but that's something we can do into the future, but no, there were no specific suggestions.
Is it, I'm just, thinking about data collection and thinking about, you said it's about how the local school systems are each collecting it and trying to make it fit the state form, right? Because my understanding is that the education article has a requirement of a template form, right? But each school system can have its own form that may have additional things or pieces, whatever to it. So is it something where having a standardized electronic form would be helpful? Is that one item that would be of use in this situation?
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes sense. Yes.
All right, good. Thank you. Any additional input? I know we're right at 12 o'clock, but I think we got to the very last slide. So I will open it up if there's anything else that didn't get addressed today that you want to comment on, or we can hold those over to December, whatever is your pleasure, Dr. Arlotto.
Thank you. No, if there's anything that is pressing on anybody's mind that wasn't discussed or they wanted just to bring up further, I think we can do that now fairly quickly. Otherwise, it was indeed a great discussion. I appreciate everybody taking the time to do this. Kate, hats off to you and your team for compiling the information that we can have this discussion, and look forward to December 6th. Anybody? Okay. Not seeing any additional hands up. Thank you. Should I have a motion to adjourn? Detective Smith, thank you. A second?
Second.
Thank you, Tom. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all. We are adjourned. Appreciate the conversation. I look forward to talking with everybody some more about each of these issues on the 6th. Again, thank you, Kate, and your team.
Right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.